My uncle got disappeared by Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was watching one of your shows tonight when I started to remember something that happened to me when I was very, very young. I tried to fact check parts of this with my older sister, but she's really a complete jerk, so the only thing she would tell me was that we really did have an uncle by that name, which I remembered. And he really did disappear in an early snowstorm in the woods up near Canada, way back in the mid-1960s. She refused to comment, either to confirm or deny any of the stuff about the werewolves or Dogman. So the account I'm about to relate will include my memories of the day Uncle Alistair disappeared, and the few conversations I remember having about it with my mother towards the end of her life. Since my parents have both been gone for many years, that was about all the research I knew how to do in order to try to validate any of these facts. Seeing as my memories come from when I must have been between 4 and 6 years old, I clearly cannot count this as something I can swear to be fact. A child's mind, when it's that young, is not the same as an adult's mind, and there are different kinds of realities which might mix together. Be that as it may, we do know that my memories about my uncle were about a real person that did go missing, so maybe there's also some truth to the rest of this as well. At any rate, let's view this as an exercise in memory, and a story to be viewed for entertainment purposes only, as it might partially stem from my childhood imagination. I remember I was watching our old black and white TV, and it was showing one of those old TV shows where a man in some kind of costume would introduce cartoons. No, it wasn't cartoons, it was puppets. Maybe this guy did puppets and cartoons, I'm not sure. It was the mid-1960s during the early Beatles era, when the culture was still mostly in black and white. Like this show I was watching, I don't know if they might have transmitted it in black and white or color, but all our TV could pick up was black and white either way. If there was any psychedelia in the world yet, it didn't make its way into my childhood memories. The phone rang, and it was my uncle, who I'm calling Alistair for this story. I remember my mother talking loudly on the phone, and I remember turning the volume up on the TV and getting scolded for it. After that, I was forced to listen to my mother's conversation with Uncle Alistair. It started friendly, but got kinda tense pretty quickly. My mother's sister, who was also Uncle Alistair's sister, grabbed the living room phone to join the conversation, and now all hope of watching TV was kaput. The phone conversation proved to be far more memorable, obviously, since I'm still talking about it almost 60 years later. Uncle Alistair was calling from his tricked-out log cabin in the woods. He worked in advertising, and he did pretty well for himself. To get to his cabin, you had to drive into the woods of northern Michigan, park your car, then walk up a steep and slippery dirt path. But then once you got inside the cabin, it had like shag carpeting and a fancy vinyl stereo system and all the mod cons. How they got the refrigerator and multiple air conditioners up that steep hill was considered by my mother to be as great a mystery as Tiwanaku. I heard he had a giant old-school microwave oven in there, too, but maybe that's just part of the legend of the place. My mother took it over, and I did get to see it later on in the 70s, but by then, a lot of his appliances and gadgets were wrecked and in a pile in the back, rusting. My parents had gotten to see it in its glory days, and they would gush about it, being from the future, but placed in the middle of the primeval and prehistoric-seeming wilderness that exists up there near Canada. They spoke in hushed and awed tones, describing my uncle's answering machine for his phone, something that only important people had back in those days. Wow, leave a message for him when he isn't even there? To my mom and my aunt, their brother was like George Jetson or something. They looked up to him in ways that family members don't seem to respect each other any longer. So when he would call, they'd want to know if he was in his brownstone in New York or one of his summer homes, or perhaps on vacation. This time he was in his log cabin in the woods, and both sisters oohed, awed. You'd have thought they were talking to Superman calling from his fortress at the North Pole. Almost immediately, though, this conversation took a weird turn. Alistair kept breaking up, which used to happen a lot on long-distance calls in those days, to be honest. I think it was all a wired system, not satellite or Wi-Fi, but you could still get static and interference much of the time. According to what I was hearing, through the sisters speaking loudly, in the house there with me in the safe suburbs of central Michigan, there was a late October snowstorm happening around the log cabin. That caused my uncle to have a growing awareness that he might be stuck up there for a few days past his original intention due to the snow. Alistair was reading off a list of people he needed my mother to call and deliver messages to from him, as his telephone service seemed as though it was getting ready to go. Both sisters urged Alistair to get out of there right away, and he admitted he had been considering it. The idea of being away from his job and responsibility for 36 to 48 hours, though, that seemed too tempting to give up. He was a very hard-working man, and I think he looked forward to the idea of a day or two in the woods alone, watching the snow fall. He admitted that if he left right away, he might still have time to get out of the path of the storm, but he was feeling so lazy. And in the middle of this sort of really ordinary conversation, suddenly everything got really weird. My mom and her sister sort of jumped in the air, and then kept asking, "What was that noise? What was that noise?" And then, "What was that other noise?" They seemed alarmed in a way that I still remember finding upsetting. It was scary to me as a kid to see adults looking so frightened, as my sense of safety derived largely from assuming that they could handle any major crises that headed our way. Now I could see that something they were hearing on that phone was scaring and unnerving my aunt and my mother, and so that phone conversation had my full attention. My older sister came home from school or something, and she was drawn in as well, until my aunt was holding the phone so that the three of us could lean in and listen all at once. That was our family's version of a speakerphone, I guess. So once the thumping started, my uncle was putting the phone down and running around the cabin, occasionally coming back to give us reports of what was happening. What he told us next was the single most important reason that I still remember all of this, even if my sister won't speak on this part of the story. My Uncle Alistair told us that his log cabin, with all the fancy modern stuff inside, was under attack by a group of what looked to him like werewolves or weredogs. I think he said weredogs. I remember at first having trouble envisioning what a weredog might be. I thought maybe that meant a big, angry dog running around outside, or a few of them. As we continued to get snatches of new info each time he grabbed the phone to give us an update, a picture was slowly painted for us. They had the heads of wolves, but they stood up, looking like monkeys with canine heads. The light brown orangey fur was very long and all over the body, sort of like an orangutan, except they were tall and fit. I don't remember what size he said they were, but I remember he said there had to be at least 3 of them out there, circling his cabin. Occasionally they would run up and slam into the house, then run away. He saw glimpses of them running away, but he never actually saw them hit the place, and wasn't sure what they were actually doing when they hit it. My uncle told us that if they chose to run at any of the house's windows, they could probably easily get themselves into the cabin itself. Uncle Alistair wanted to close the outside wooden window covers on the 2 front windows, but he'd have to open the windows up first and reach outside to do that, thereby making himself vulnerable. Plus, once the wooden doors were closed into place, he'd have much less of a view than he already had of what was happening outside. My uncle came back to the phone at one point, telling us this stuff about what was happening that I don't really remember, but I remember suddenly his doorbell was ringing. Like it rang once and he was like, "Who would be ringing my doorbell?" Then it rang a bunch more times, and he told us it might be someone in trouble, so he put down the phone to go see. When he got back on, he sounded like he was pretty shaken up. Uncle Alistair said that when he opened the door to see who was there, nobody was. Then he looked down and saw that someone had laid a really big owl across his doorstep. It was pretty large enough to go from side to side of the door frame. It was not moving and seemed to have passed away, although there was no obvious sign of external injury. Now that's gotta freak you out. Even people who tell me this story isn't scary have to admit that's a pretty freaky thing to have happen. It's like something from a different story inserted into a Dogman story for no reason. Like, what is that? Blair Witch or something? Who leaves an owl lying on someone's doorstep? What does that even mean? If your cat leaves you the remains of a mouse or a bird, that's supposed to actually be a tribute to you. Were the Dogman giving my uncle the owl as a sign of respect? If so, that was not how he took it. And after that, I remember the uncomfortable feeling that all the adults were getting really scared. It was at this point that my aunt wrote the cabin's location down on a piece of paper and handed it to my older sister, instructing her to go use one of the neighbors' phones to call the authorities in order to send the police over to the log cabin. My sister started whining that she didn't want to, but eventually she relented and ran off to do as she had been asked. Uncle Alistair started to calm down as he and my mom talked about different possible meanings of the owl being left where it was. My mother was certain it had to mean something. It had to have been meant to communicate something that other dogmen or werewolves would understand. While they were engaging in their somewhat intellectual, heady discussion of symbols and meaning, my uncle was becoming his old self again. But in the middle of a sentence, he seemed to have suddenly noticed that he was being watched through one of the windows. This changed his voice completely, and he became a stutterer, transfixed by the figure outside that was staring in at him. He described the thing to us as they stared at each other. "It looks like a dog," he said, "but it has that light of intelligence in its eyes, so you can tell it's a lot smarter than a dog is supposed to be." It also looked rather cold to him, not only because it was standing out there in the falling snow. This creature was cold from the inside. Even the glow coming from its eyes was a blue one, not all the same as the warm incandescent light inside my uncle's cabin. I had never seen a blue-eyed dog at that point in my childhood, so this was another thing that stuck out in my memory about the incident. As I grew up, whenever I would meet a blue-eyed dog, it would of course flash me right back into this story. It was little things like that which I think prevented me from ever fully forgetting this event. There are times when I'm thinking about it that I sort of remember two slightly different versions of little parts of it. So I know that I might be mixing memories with reimaginings or conflated bits of different events from way back then. I would dream about my uncle and the werewolves and telephones that connected you directly to where something terrible and supernatural was happening. At the same time, it was sunny and clear, and there were cartoons on TV where you were. In my dreams, I'd start off upset and sad that my uncle was under attack from the Dogman, but I'd feel that at least I was safe on the other end of that phone line. Somehow in my dreams, though, the Dogman would be able to see me through the phone and know where I lived. Sometimes the dreams would have me finding a Dogman in the house. Sometimes there would be a number of them, chasing me through the neighborhood at night, saying they were going to take me to where they took my uncle. I had this dream with such regularity and in so many variations, sometimes involving me forgetting to do homework or being unable to study because I had to spend so much time running away from the pack of dogmen. I don't even remember for certain which parts happened in reality and which parts only happened in my dreams over the decades since. I remember my uncle crying on the phone, and my aunt and my mom tearing up too. I tried to hide that I was crying because I figured I'd be sent to my room. It wasn't often that I got to listen in on adult phone conversations, and I'd never known that werewolves could be real. I wanted to keep quiet. I hope nobody made me miss any part of that weird conversation. But it was impossible not to cry as a kid if everyone around you was beating you to it. People sniffled for a while, and nobody seemed to really be able to say much. After some time, Uncle Alistair mentioned that it sounded like the bullies were done with him for the moment. He looked around outside and saw nothing but the snow starting to come down a little more in earnest. Coming back to the phone, Alistair signed off, saying he was going to make a break for it down the hill path and try to get south before the snow became a genuine storm. My sister tried to talk him out of it, but he made her promise to make those phone calls for him. And then he told us that he loved us, and he hung up. After taking a moment to compose herself, my mom asked my aunt to take care of making me dinner as she got on the phone to make that list of phone calls to her brother's business associates, informing them that he would be late getting back to each of them. In fact, even to this day, Uncle Alistair has never again been in touch with any of those ladies or gentlemen. He disappeared, was presumed lost in the storm, which made the area of the log cabin inaccessible for some amount of time. I forget how long. It was a kind of a pall that hung over my mom and my aunt for another 7 years or however long it was until he was officially declared deceased. If my uncle's body was ever recovered at any point after that, the news never filtered down to me. I remember in the early 70s when my mom and her sister inherited stuff and bank accounts left behind by my Uncle Alistair. It made them both greedy, and it started mean fights between them until they both stopped talking to each other. They used to be together almost every day for decades, but that's what money can do, even to sisters. It makes them so stupid that they think they're smart. If you care more about being smart than being kind, man, well, actually, that's how I act too, so okay, but just don't use me for a role model. When my mother passed, she had been ill for a few months and spent a lot of time bedridden in the hospital. She was often able to hold conversations, though, and we might have talked more during that time, just before the end, than we ever had before. When we would bring up Uncle Alistair, I would get these two different kinds of reactions from her, which seemed contradictory to me. Not to her, though. What I mean is, when I would bring up the dogman or werewolves that had been circling the log cabin, my mother would say that she didn't believe in any of that. I reminded her that I was listening in on the other phone line when it happened, but she still insisted that she didn't believe that the werewolf was really there. She admitted she did used to believe it. She believed in it for years, but not after some certain things had happened to her. When I asked her to elaborate, Mom told me that since she'd been in the hospital, on the range of medications they had been pumping into her, she had begun sometimes seeing odd things. She had seen a little man in the room, just a few inches tall. He looked sort of like an elf, and sort of like a space alien, and its outfit was shiny. She told me that she wasn't sure if it was the drugs that had made her see him, or if it was the fact that she knew she was going to pass on to the next plane of existence soon. But in neither case did she really believe that the 6-inch tall man was actually there in the room, in the same sense that she or I were. Similarly, she wasn't sure if the reason my uncle thought he was seeing werewolves might have been because of whatever cocktails the fashionable advertising elite were drinking or snorting in those days. Or it might have been because he, like her, was about to pass on to the other side. In either case, she didn't think they existed outside of his nervous system, and she had her reasons for feeling that way. I can't say that I know enough to refute her argument. I was only at the cabin that one time, and we did leave before nightfall. Maybe Mom thought the Dogman was a mental illusion, but she wasn't willing to stay past sundown to test that theory out. So the only thing I suppose we can say is an absolute proven fact is that my uncle vanished that day after he called us. And yet, no matter how my mother might have felt about it, I still feel deep down inside that my uncle got disappeared by Dogman. If you sort of feel cursed but you'd rather feel blessed, you need to meet a person who's just like CS. When you try and you give but fate gives you strife, you need a CS to enter your life. Please join us in thanking CS, who has literally been keeping this channel afloat for some time now. She is our executive producer today and on most days, and I wish we could do something more to pay tribute to her kindness and her generosity. Thank you, CS, for donating to us directly using our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. It gets through to us in a second and can go toward food and other immediate expenses that we need to pay in order to keep the show on the air. There are lots of other ways you can help as well. And here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman, to fill in the deets. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button. Or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.